Welcome again to our study entitled Absence Makes the Heart Grow Fonder, where we're walking through Paul's letter to the Philippians. We're going to be handling our next section, which is chapter 1, verses 12 through 20. And so we'll begin with verse 12. Now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually advanced the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to everyone else that my imprisonment is because I am in Christ. Most of the brothers have gained confidence in the Lord from my imprisonment, and dare even more to speak the word fearlessly. Now, Paul is letting these Christian brothers and sisters of his back in Philippi know what has happened to them. They know because they're concerned about him. And that seems to be the reason that Paul is wanting to explain to them what has happened to them. You see that explained right here in this word, imprisonment. He has been imprisoned for doing the work of sharing the gospel. He mentioned this back in verse 7, which says, "Indeed, it was right for me to think this way about all of you, because I have you in my heart, and you are all partners with me in grace, both in my imprisonment and in the defense and confirmation of the gospel." And so we know the Christians in Philippi were aware of Paul's imprisonment. They were continuing to fellowship with Paul in his imprisonment. The question becomes, which imprisonment was this? The scriptures mention Paul being in prison 3 times. You have Jerusalem, you have Caesarea, and then you also have Rome. But there are writings from the first century that mention Paul being in prison up to 8 different times. And there's no way to really know which imprisonment Paul is talking about here. You can take little clues, like the fact that he mentions the imperial guard in this passage. Well, that mentioning of this imperial guard makes some believe that maybe Paul was imprisoned in Rome, where there would be an imperial guard. But others have argued that many of the major Roman cities would have some of the imperial guard. And so maybe he's just speaking of the whole imperial guard at his present location. There's also a traveling back and forth with Epaphroditus that we'll talk about in a later lesson. Well, that makes it difficult to believe that Paul was imprisoned in Rome, because to go back and forth from Rome to Philippi would have been a very long travel. And so others have assumed maybe this is his imprisonment that supposedly happened in Ephesus or some other town that would have been closer to Philippi. There's really no way of knowing. What we do know is that the Christians in Philippi were concerned about him because he was in jail, because he was in chains. And he wanted them to know that God was using those circumstances for the good of the gospel. It's interesting, later in the book of Philippians, that chapter 2, verse 17, he talked about being poured out as a drink offering. Well, that implies maybe even he was facing death. Maybe he was facing the circumstances that he wasn't sure whether he was going to get out of this or not. He does talk confidently about escaping this in chapter 1, but there's always the possibility that he wouldn't. And so Paul was willing to give everything, even be killed, for the sake of the gospel. Notice he's excited about what has happened, because what has happened has actually advanced the gospel. That's happened for a couple of reasons. One reason you find is that it caused the gospel to become known throughout the imperial guard, and the other one is because it has caused his brethren to gain confidence and to speak the word fearlessly. Well, that I find amazing. I find it amazing that his suffering, his persecution, what he is dealing with, has caused people to speak out, and to speak out with more courage, and to speak out more confidently. One takeaway that I pull out of this passage is from a more personal basis is, how would I respond? If there were a brother of mine who was known for preaching the gospel, who is known for being a great servant of the Lord. And as a result of his service for the Lord, he had been thrown into prison. And he had been there for some time enough for me to be able to get a letter hand delivered to him and maybe even get a couple of letters back. And there's kind of a give and take. He's been in prison this whole time. I don't know that would cause me to want to go out there and talk to my neighbor about the gospel, knowing that my neighbor could turn me in and I could be arrested for it. But it did for these people. It didn't cause them to cower in fear, which might be my response. It didn't cause them to hide, which we might justify. Well, we'll just hide for the time being until all of this passes. No, it caused them to gain confidence. It caused them to dare to speak fearlessly. Is that what happens to us when we're facing persecution? What would be our reaction? Well, I think that's something to consider as we go through this book that Paul wrote to the Philippians. The next section says, "To be sure, some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. These preach out of love, knowing that I'm appointed for the defense of the gospel. The others preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, thinking that they will cause me trouble in my imprisonment. What does it matter? Only that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is proclaimed, and in this I rejoice." There's an interesting structure to this particular section, a structure of positives and negatives, of both positive statements about some and negative statements about others. Here's what I mean by that. You have several contrasts drawn here in the passage. You've got a contrast between envy and goodwill. Some are preaching out of envy, some are preaching out of goodwill. You've got a contrast between love and selfish ambition. That some are acting with the motivation of love, and some are doing it because they're gaining some sort of selfish benefit to going around and teaching about Christ. Others are doing it from false motives, and still others are doing it from true motives. It's interesting in the structure how you have envy to selfish ambition and false motives. That in the first sentence, you've got envy, the negative mentioned first. In the second sentence, you've got the negative mentioned second. In the third sentence, you have the negative mentioned first. In that same manner, you've got the positive mentioned second, then mentioned first, and then mentioned second again. And it's kind of all jumbled up and mixed up in there, and it's all pieced together in that passage. And there's no real order to it or prioritizing of the terms. That says something to me. It says to me that people's motives really shouldn't be our concern. Their motives are not what we should be judging. We shouldn't be only looking for people who are doing the right thing for good reason, because people who are doing the right thing for wrong reasons, well, they're still doing the right thing. We spend a lot of time bickering over people's motivations, whether that be those in the denominational world, why they're preaching Christ. They're doing it because they're gaining money. They're doing it because they feel power. They're doing it because they have some sort of personal benefit for it. Or we even do that to those in the church, where we will lambaste and say negative things about our brothers and sisters and why they do the things they do. We might talk about a new Christian and talk about how weak they are and selfish they are and how they don't really want to truly serve God. Or we might even talk about preachers in the same way and have that conversation about those who are out there doing the work. We talk about elders negatively. The truth is, we need to spend less time focusing in on people's motivations and more time focusing in on what actually needs to be done. You'll notice here, Paul says, what does it matter? Does it really matter whether they're doing it out of love or whether they're doing it out of selfish ambition? Does it really matter whether they're doing it out of some sort of rivalry with somebody else or they're doing it because they truly just love the gospel? To Paul, it didn't. Paul says it doesn't matter. What really matters to Paul is that in every way, Christ is proclaimed. That's what matters. That we get out there and we talk about Christ. And it's interesting to me that in this section that we're talking about today, back in verse 14, it talked about speaking the gospel. Here in verse 15, it talked about preaching the gospel. Then it talked about proclaiming the gospel. And then down here it mentions proclaiming again. Paul was concerned that Christ be taught, that the gospel be shared. And if the gospel could be shared, then we could be rejoicing. That's the goal. Are we really sharing Christ? And sometimes we might share Christ out of obligation, share him. Sometimes we share Christ out of excitement and enthusiasm, share. Sometimes we share Christ because we don't know what else to do. It's just obedience, or it's just our habit. Then share him. But all that we do, in every way, we should be sharing Christ, proclaiming Christ, preaching Christ, and not worrying about people's motivations. The next section, the end of verse 18 says, "Yes, and I will continue to rejoice because I know this will lead to my salvation through your prayers and help from the Spirit of Jesus Christ. My eager expectation and hope is that I will not be ashamed about anything, but that now, as always, with all courage, Christ will be highly honored in my body, whether by life or by death." It's very clear that Paul absolutely expected to be saved from this situation that he was in. And the reason he was going to be saved is because of their prayers and because help was going to come from God. Not just this was something that he thought was a possibility, but it becomes very clear that this was his eager expectation and hope. He absolutely expected to be set free from prison. But it is also interesting to me that he says, even if not, even if I experience death, even or whether I get to continue on living, what really mattered to him was that Christ would be honored in his body. Is that our concern? Is that the way we approach our faith? Is that what we do as we serve God, that we do life or death? Whether life is going to be easy or it's going to be hard, we're going to do the job of serving the Lord. This reminds me of a great story from the Old Testament in Daniel chapter 3, where Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were thrown into the fiery furnace. When Nebuchadnezzar threatened them with it because they wouldn't bow down to his golden image, their words of faith there are absolutely astonishing. Chapter 3 of Daniel, verse 17 says, "If the God we serve exists, then he can rescue us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he can rescue us from the power of you, the king. But even if he does not rescue us, we want you as king to know that we will not serve your gods or worship the gold statue you set up." Is that our attitude? That whether life or death, whether persecution or ease, whether things are easy or whether things are difficult, Christ will be highly honored in my body no matter what. And this is the same attitude he had earlier back in verse 10 and 11, where God was to receive the glory and praise. That should always be our goal. Our eyes should always be on Jesus and on God, that we should always be living with the expectation of the Lord coming soon and living in a way that would cause God to be glorified in all we do. Thank you for your time listening today, and stay tuned for more lessons from the book of Philippians as we learn more about how absence makes the heart grow fonder.